Good evening and welcome to our webinar tonight on PIRS's Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance program. I'm Jodie Rizet-O'Brien and I manage the Sheep Connect Pastoral Project in South Australia. Sheep Connect is an extension project for producers both in the agricultural zone but also in the pastoral areas of South Australia, where producers can be involved in practical programs that make positive change to their farm production and management. We have a great website, sheepconnectsa.com.au. Feel free to go on there and have a look. And we also have a Twitter account, so please follow us at sheepconnectsa. Sheep Connect is not possible without valuable funding partners, and we thank them, AWI, Primary Industries and Regions, and the Sheep Industry Fund of South Australia. Just take a moment, if you could please, to read the disclaimer from the Government of South Australia in regard to the webinar this evening. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panellist, Dr. Elise Spark, who's a Senior Veterinarian with PIRS Biosecurity South Australia.
Thanks very much, Jodie. So, as Jodie said, I'm one of the vets working for Primary Industries Biosecurity SA, and I've been quite heavily involved in the Enhanced Abattoir Surveillance program for a number of years now. So we just wanted to, I guess, give you all an idea of how the program works so that you can get the most out of the feedback that is sent as part of the program. And also to focus on a few of the key conditions that are monitored as part of the program, and particularly how they affect profitability or the outcomes of those conditions at an on-farm level and also at a processor or abattoir level. So I guess in a nutshell, this is really what the program is all about. It's about providing feedback to South Australian producers that are consigning sheep directly to Thomas Foods abattoirs. So it's getting that feedback back to producers, and it's feedback that is, I guess, being captured as part of the normal meat inspection process. So for every line of sheep and lambs that go through Thomas Foods, there's meat inspectors who are effectively assessing that line for issues that may cause a problem from a food safety point of view. So damage, diseases, contamination, those sorts of things. And there's meat inspectors stationed on the carcasses and also on the corresponding red and green offal trays. And they're inspectors that are independent to the abattoir, so they're actually employed by a third party. And they're there as part of that process, and for everything that's sort of found, they make an assessment or an estimate of the line that is affected by any of these conditions. And that's the data that is then fed back to PIRSA and distributed out to producers. So it's different, obviously, to the feedback that comes directly from the processor. It's not looking at individual condemnation information, which is something that the processors send out directly. This is really looking at, has a line of animals got a level of disease that we would therefore class that as being a flock problem. So it's about getting that flock information back to producers so that they can use that information in a way that both improves health on farm, welfare, and maximises productivity and profitability. So it's been set up and designed primarily with a focus on producers. But one of the things that, as an aside from that, is that for all of these conditions where there's a potential impact to the carcass or the offal at the processor, by reducing those particular conditions, we certainly are seeing a reduced amount or level of wasted products that could otherwise be used. You know, you're sort of looking at potentially $10, $12 of offal value for each carcass. And so if we're seeing less and less conditions that are affecting those, and also obviously less and less conditions that are affecting the carcass and what needs to happen there, then the flow-on of this actual individual producer information is that we have that reduced waste. So we're actually very, very lucky in South Australia for this program. We're actually the only state that provides this feedback to producers. And the reason for that is that this program is funded primarily out of the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund. for the levy that's collected. There's also some funding from Animal Health Australia, and now we've just partnered with Meat Livestock Australia for the MDC project. But for that reason, we have been able to, for over 10 years, provide this feedback. And on a cost basis, the program operates at less than sort of 0.1% of the cheap meat value in SA. So we've monitored millions of sheep, most of which are South Australian in origin, and sent more than 80,000 letters. It is a program that captures at least 50% of SA producers, but of course this does vary between regions. We have a lot less coming through Thomas Foods International from the southeast, so probably a quarter to a third of southeast producers will be getting feedback from this program. But places like Kangaroo Island and also the Eyre Peninsula, we're seeing a lot more of a representation, just purely based on logistics and other processes in the areas. It is operating and has only ever operated at Thomas Foods International, but we are working closely with JBS to have them come on board soon. And as I think I said, it's about those direct lines. So although we monitor sale yard lines and we're monitoring interstate lines, it's only the direct lines that get the feedback as part of this program. So we're not tracing mixed consignments from sale yards and working out who's who. It's really just that direct feedback between known pick numbers that are arriving with lots. The other thing that historically, we've only ever sent out letters when a problem has been found. So if there's an issue at 5% or more of the line found, then we'll send out that information. We hadn't previously sent out clean line information, so information on lines where there were no conditions detected. However, recently we have developed an email system, and that was really developed so that we could send out this clean line information. And I guess going back a step, the reason that we didn't send out clean line information previously was because of the fact that the letters and the postage costs would have just been prohibitive in that manner. But with email, it also gives producers the option to select whether or not they would like correspondence via email or via post, or both. Obviously, email will provide a more timely feedback as opposed to waiting for the post and when you're next getting down to the PO box. But it also gives us the ability to send out information on clean lines, because that's obviously of value to producers too. But as I mentioned in the very first slide, a clean line from this program's point of view doesn't mean that there might have been one or two animals condemned by the processor. As I said, this is about the flock condition reaching 5%, so it's important not to be confused thinking that we've said it's a clean line and the processor has said that you've had one animal condemned. So anyone who's wishing to update their information or receive their feedback via email can do so if they haven't already got an email listed against their PIC number with Biosecurity SA. That can certainly be added very easily. And so I guess it's probably not a concept that is hard to grasp by anybody as to why feedback is so important. And really, people can't do things about an issue if they don't know about them. So at other processes and prior to this program, these issues may have been there, but without producers knowing about them, there's really no way that if they wish to use that information, they can. And I think it was 2014, we sent out a survey to all of the producers who had consigned to Thomas Foods in the previous 12 months. And we had 1,000 responders to that survey. And one of the questions that we asked was whether or not they had been alerted to a disease or condition they didn't know they had on farm. And it was about 2/3 of producers that responded in this manner. So it is really important, because some of these conditions the producer would have absolutely no idea that they have on farm without this feedback. So there are conditions where they do not affect sheep health on farm, and I guess a good example of that is ovis or sheep measles, but at the processor level can have a big impact, particularly at high levels. So without this feedback, a producer would be completely blind to the fact that this condition is on farm and potentially causing a problem. So I guess this is an analogy I quite like, and although we're dealing with nature and so we can't really compare biology to cans or bottles of Coke, this is really what we're wanting, or when I say we're talking about what industry wants, what processors want, what producers want, is consistent lines of quality animals with minimal trim, because these animals, when they're consistent, when they're intact, when they haven't been damaged or diseased, provides maximum returns for both the producer and the processor. What we don't want is a whole lot of conditions, disease, contamination that results in carcasses being, or parts of carcasses being trimmed, or carcasses being condemned. And these are some examples of some of the conditions that would result in that before this carcass or these carcasses are weighed at the grading station. And of course, any trim that is lost before weighing at the grading station is lost kilos to the producer. So we'll talk more about the specific conditions and how they impact a bit further on. So look, the list of conditions is quite long, and it can be difficult to work out what's important. And we will be talking about the more important conditions from a profitability and productivity point of view tonight. But this table has really divided these conditions into four main areas. And the top left quadrant is really the conditions that have the most impact, because they have an impact not only to a producer on farm, or to the sheep and therefore a producer on farm, but also an impact at the abattoir. And certainly grass seeds, pleurisy and arthritis, which we'll talk about, certainly fit into that category. On the top right, we have conditions that may have an effect on farm, but certainly from a producer point of view, they don't impact what they're being paid at processing. And these are conditions that affect organs, so livers and kidneys, so cirrhosis, nephritis, those sorts of things. And that is because those organs are just rendered, so they're not producers aren't paid for them. If those organs are condemned, then they just go down the rendering chute. But of course, the processor loses out on not being able to use those organs for sale. The bottom left, these conditions, and I did mention previously, sheep measles or ovis, are those that have an effect at the abattoir, but don't have an impact on farm. And certainly sheep measles, you wouldn't know an animal is affected. And other vaccine lesions, dog bites, bruising, those sorts of things have more of an impact to carcass being trimmed. And the bottom right, we won't go into these, but these are a few conditions where they either are mainly seen as condens, so cancer, fever, septicemia, or conditions that we don't really see in South Australia or at a very high level. So for the purposes of tonight, we won't go much into those. So I don't know how many of you have seen this feedback, but I just wanted to alert you to how this comes out. And really, we send out information on the line, so producers can compare that to the kill sheets. So, where the sheep processed, obviously at the moment it's just only occurring at Lobethal with the Murray Bridge fire, the date, the lot number, the number killed. And for any of those conditions that have been detected at 5% or more, they're recorded there as a percentage of the line. So arthritis, 5% in a line of 521, it's not 5 animals, it's always reported as a 5%. And along with that feedback, for any condition detected, a fact sheet is sent out. And these fact sheets are really a starting point for producers to get an idea of, what causes the condition, what might be seen on farm, and what can be used as what potential steps can be taken for treating or preventing, and so on and so forth. So these are a good starting point for producers then to seek further information. And the other thing that we have developed on a region-by-region basis is benchmarking documents. And so we've got 10 of these that have been developed for each region, and we update these on a 12-month period. And what we have, and I've just sort of screenshotted the top part of this benchmarking document, we've got this divided into, obviously, the condition. And then grass seeds is at the top because we see an impact on farm, which is indicated by the little windmills, and also at the abattoir, which is indicated by the little meat cleavers. So down the list, obviously, the impact, depending on where it is, will drop, and we see a reduction in both of those symbols, indicating that the condition may cause less of an impact. And then for each of those conditions, we're looking at them by age category, so lamb and then mutton, because there are some conditions that really don't an impact in lamb at all, and really our conditions that we see in mutton. I guess on this particular screenshot, cheesy gland is a good indication or a good example of that, where we really just see cheesy gland coming through in mutton. And then the final part of the division is looking at the percentage of producers who consigned affected stock. So, for example, in Region 1, 12% of producers from this region consigned lambs with arthritis. So when producers get feedback, they can have a look at it and say, well, I'm one of 12%, or I might be one of 30%, or and just get an indication for sort of how they are doing, how you're doing in comparison to peers. And the final section is the average percentage of stock affected within those affected lines. So within those lines that have come from those 12% of producers, on average 7% are affected with arthritis in the lamb category. And so if someone's getting a feedback report of 20%, we know that that's certainly well in excess of what's average for those who are sending affected stock. It doesn't mean if you're getting a report of 5% that's normal. It just gives people an idea of where they sit in their region, because it's obviously we see very different levels of conditions coming from over on the Eyre Peninsula as we might do on Kangaroo Island. So it is important that producers can look at a region by region. So another, in addition to the benchmarking results, other things that can be used to interpret feedback at a point in time where the processors haven't got a system where they can record, obviously the trim is recorded on a carcass by carcass basis, but we haven't got that matched through. So if we lose a forequarter, we can't say we lose a forequarter because of X condition. So there is a little bit of jigsaw puzzle work for a producer to appreciate if the conditions that have been seen in the line, do they normally cause a trim? And if so, is that trimming significant, and therefore have I lost money? And so, producers might have lines coming through at 24 kilos, and then all of a sudden a 16 kilo carcass comes through. That'll be a fair indication that carcass was trimmed quite significantly. But we have over the recent times been working quite closely with Thomas Foods to try and get a bit more of that information in regards to what has been trimmed, even if we don't necessarily know the cause correlation. So the producers have got a bit more information. Hopefully that will be filtering through in the near future. As we mentioned, looking at the benchmarking information, the other thing is it's important to factor in is whether or not you're trading sheep or whether you've bred the sheep on farm, because obviously it may be not an issue that has been caused since the sheep have been brought onto the farm, but previously. So it might have been a case of bringing in a problem. And on that note, I guess some of these conditions, they're permanent. So if someone was to buy stock, for example, with ovis or sheep measles, the little cysts that indicative of this particular condition, once they're there, they're always there as scars. So for any management or changes for some of these conditions that are made, it's really important to remember that there's going to be a lag and a time period between when those changes are made and when you actually see a result of those changes at the processor. The other thing that's important to consider is whether or not you've actually consigned stock directly to Thomas Foods before, because you might suddenly get a report come through and you've never had any indication that you've had this condition on farm. It may have always been there, but if you haven't ever had the feedback from Thomas Foods because you haven't sent there, then this is really important to remember, to put it into perspective. Likewise, if you have been consigning to Thomas Foods for a number of consignments or years, then having a little look at trends over time can be really useful. Are you going up or are you going down, or is there sort of a real sudden change? So we have mentioned the fact that these conditions do have an impact on farm and at slaughter, and really, I guess from an on-farm point of view, a lot of the productivity loss can be quite silent. So that's really important when looking at these conditions. Is it's not, obviously there's some conditions that are very obvious. You may have arthritis and you've got lambs hobbling around, but others, and a good example is something like rib fractures, where you might just see a condition like this take an extra few weeks to finish the animals. And so it may not be really obvious, but it's still certainly causing an impact. Some of the conditions result in cost of treatment or prevention, and obviously losses and welfare considerations as well. At the processor, we've mentioned trimming, and we've mentioned the fact that therefore there's weight lost. But the other important thing to mention with trimming is the fact that you not only lose the kilos, but there's a chance as well that that carcass then slides down the grid. So there's sort of double loss. Condemnations for some of the conditions are possible, and certainly for grass seeds there can be a penalty on a cents per kilo basis applied. And also really any time a carcass is trimmed, it obviously isn't a whole carcass. In some cases you've lost fat, you've lost muscle, the carcass dries out. So anything that sort of damages that carcass as a result of trimming means that that carcass is generally not able to be used as a high value fresh chilled product, has to be downgraded to a frozen product, and in some cases obviously it's the processor that loses out with what they can do with that, but it's certainly a loss in value. So as we looked with that grid with the 4 sections earlier on, the top 3 conditions really are grass seeds, pleurisy and arthritis. So we'll talk mainly about these conditions, but we'll also focus on a couple of others. So we'll start with grass seeds. And these are a couple of photos of some seedy carcasses. And normally what would happen is if a producer's being penalised by the abattoir, then they will take photos and send those photos through. So, the other important thing to note is that the penalty system by the abattoir is completely independent to this program. So it's not unusual for a producer to get feedback from us saying, you've got 80% grass seeds in your line, and receive no information from the processor. And the reason for this, that we still, regardless of whether the seeds are light, medium or heavy, regardless of the location of the seeds, we still want producers to know about them rather than waiting for seeds to get to a point that the processor is imposing a penalty. We feel that that producers really need to know at the early stages, but that obviously can be a bit of a disconnect, and people can get a bit confused as to why they're receiving feedback with this program and not from the processor. And the penalty that is applied, the reason for that is because of the increased processing costs that are associated with these carcasses. So obviously these carcasses can't just be processed in a normal manner. In some instances the chain needs to be slowed down so they can be trimmed properly. These carcasses may end up on the retain rail, the pathology rail. And what happens on the pathology rail is obviously when you get too many carcasses there, the processing can't continue. So in some instances they have to be, whole trim teams need to come in. Obviously that product is very low value once you've trimmed all those seeds out. So the penalties that are imposed is really associated with those increased costs. So you've got those impacts at the processor. Certainly, grass seeds cause an incredible issue on farm from a productivity point of view, and I guess one good example of that is in lambs post-weaning, where as few as 25 seeds can reduce daily growth rate by up to 50%, and not to mention their welfare issue and the discounts and the issues with wool, skin value, and so on and so forth. The other important thing to note is that seeds, they're vegetative material. They don't just disappear once an animal has been infected with seeds. They can last in the carcass for 18 to 24 months. So producers need to be aware, they've bought some lambs off or sheep off shears, or they've been in the feedlot and they can't understand when they're then getting reports back because they didn't really feel that there could possibly be a seed problem, but they're certainly going to stay around. And I think the biggest issue, we do see a lot of seeds coming through upper southeast and Murray Mallee, and I certainly think with management side of things that often there is inconsistency between people who are sort of managing pastures really, really well, but they're missing out on shelter belts or laneways and those sorts of things and coming unstuck there. So if producers do have issues with seeds, the best resource that's available is really this Winning Against Seeds document from MLA. And there's 2 versions, a short version and a long version. I think it's sort of 40 to 60 pages. So that's a really good starting point for producers and runs through lots of different options when seeds are an issue. And the picture on the right is just a picture of the pathology rail. Normally it might just have half a dozen carcasses on there. They're all spread out, and this is an example where they just couldn't keep processing because the path rail was just chock-a-block. Moving on to pleurisy and pneumonia. The picture, so we've got a couple of carcasses here. The picture on the top left is an example of really fresh pleurisy and pneumonia. So that's the front legs of the lamb hanging down and the lungs hanging out between those front legs. And what we've got is an instance where we've got pneumonia that has turned into pleurisy. So the infection that's inside the lungs has entered the chest cavity, and all that grot on the surface of the lungs is what sticks those lungs to the chest cavity. So the top picture is a fresh case of pleurisy pneumonia. And that carcass would have been likely condemned from a point of view of food safety. We don't see that picture coming through the processor very often. The picture at the bottom is what we see long term, and these are these sort of scarred adhesions between, so the infection's long gone, but we've got these scarred adhesions which stick those lungs to the rib cage, and they've got to be trimmed out. And so the picture on the right-hand side is exactly the same carcass there, following trim, and you can sort of see the loss there and the mess that makes. Arthritis. Now, arthritis is probably up there with those top three conditions because it can result in quite significant trim. And there was a lady, a vet by the name of Joan Lloyd, who did a fair bit of work in the arthritis space with Thomas Foods, and she was actually part of her project was looking at the association between tail length and arthritis, and as part of that she was weighing average trim, and certainly from the carcass trim that she was weighing, the average is about 0.75 of a kilo. So what the meat inspectors have to do is the joint that's affected, they have to trim to the next joint. So in the case of, for example, arthritis in the knee, you actually lose that whole back leg. The middle picture here is actually a fresh case of arthritis where you've actually got fresh pus. Most of the arthritis that comes through the processor is this sort of chronically scarred, thickened, swollen joints, whereas the middle picture is a really fresh case. And so if something like that came through the works, then obviously that's a potential food safety issue. When you've got a carcass that's severely affected with arthritis and has is underweight and emaciated, and 4 or more joints are affected, then that carcass can certainly be condemned as well. The other thing that's important to note is that arthritis, you might not realise sort of how much of an issue arthritis is on farm, because it's not these animals that aren't fit to load that are ending up at the processors. Joints can be sort of quite subtly thickened, and they may not be that obvious on farm, but when the skin is off, they become quite obvious and need to be trimmed. So producers can get sort of not have quite not a full idea and a full understanding of just how bad the arthritis might be on their property if you're just looking, sort of for cripples. With that project that I mentioned, Joan did find a positive association between tail length, and the idea behind that was the fact that obviously the higher that the tails are docked, the larger the wound, and wound is where the bacteria enters to cause arthritis. And she certainly found an association, and the recommendation is to leave 3 of those tail joints when docking. Sheep measles, which we mentioned earlier. This is an example of sheep measles, and sheep measles is a condition, these are little larval cysts, and the larval cysts are the larval stage of the parasite in sheep. The adult stage of the parasite lives in dogs. And so normally we just get sort of one cyst in the heart, for example, or in the diaphragm, which is you can see in the middle picture and on the right picture. On the left is an example where you've got the carcass muscle severely affected, and 5 or more in the carcass muscle will result in a condemned carcass. And if you've ever been through the processes, you may have noticed carcasses that have been stamped with a red ink. And so and also sarco are 2 conditions where there's stamping that goes on, and those carcasses then need to be boned out fully, and that happens in the chiller. So there's quite a lot of extra work involved in processing carcasses, even just if one cyst is found in the heart, and that obviously is a cost. That all happens after the grading station. That's quite a cost to the processor. So this condition, as I mentioned, has the 2 stages. So in order to stop the spread of this condition, we either need to stop sheep becoming infected or stop dogs becoming infected. So to stop sheep becoming infected, we don't want any of these parasite eggs to be able to be consumed on the pasture, which happens with fecal contamination of the pasture. So we need, one of the recommendations in managing this problem is to worm dogs monthly with a tapewormer. By worming them monthly with a tapewormer, this life cycle of the parasite is 35 days, so we need to get in before that 35 days to stop those worms becoming adults and laying eggs. And on the flip side, as I mentioned, stopping dogs becoming infected, obviously if they eat a larval cyst, so if people are home killing, they certainly can become infected. So it's not usually practical to be cooking home kill for dogs, but if people aren't feeding just dry food, then freezing for at least a couple of weeks is one way to manage that, and not feeding offal and trying to avoid scavenging and other activities at night. I've just got, this question comes up every time I present on sheep measles. Sheep measles, a lot of people wonder whether foxes are involved in the cycle, and foxes certainly are involved in bladderworm, so a kind of, I guess you call a cousin parasite, but we don't feel that they're involved in the sheep measles cycle. And this is a graph of sheep measles prevalence across the state regions for 2017, and you can see the bar that's in red is Kangaroo Island, where there aren't any foxes. So it just sort of shows that we don't see a significant reduction based on where the fox population is. There's also a researcher by the name of David Jenkins who collected a whole lot of fox guts from around Australia, and I think of the 500 that he collected, there was sheep measles or the dog parasite in one of those foxes, and as to whether or not that was a viable parasite or not and could lay eggs, we don't know. So we really don't feel that foxes play a role, and really dog management is the number one here. Cheesy gland. Cheesy gland we certainly see come through the plant, and I wanted to show you this map of the state. This comes from 2017, and you can certainly see the northern pastoral area indicated by the darker blue colour is where we see certainly more prevalence of cheesy gland than the rest of the state. So it's a bacterial infection, and I guess it's very well controlled with vaccine. It does result in reduced wool production, up to 7% in the first year of infection, wool contamination, and in some cases an issue sort of long-term with chronic infections and ill thrift and emaciation. At the works, certainly lymph nodes need to be trimmed out and the associated tissue. The picture on the left is an example of an early cheesy gland lesion in the lungs. You can sort of see that's quite soft pus, whereas on the right-hand side, what these abscesses turn into is sort of what we describe as onion rings as they sort of dry out. Rib fractures we mentioned previously. I think the important thing to note with rib fractures is the fact that we're not talking about fresh rib fractures that happen on a truck or due to trauma. These are healed calluses on bones from previous trauma. And as I mentioned, lambs certainly take a bit longer to finish. The trimming isn't as significant because they can, as opposed to pleurisy where they have to take out a lot more. But from a processor point of view, they have estimated that rib fractures cost about $25 per carcass. So it's a really a massive processor impact, and certainly depending on where the fractures are, the carcasses may not be able to be used as for racks of lamb based on the length of rib that is still remains. So there's a fair bit of work going into this condition. Dr. Colin Trengrove is doing a PhD at the moment, so we should have more information. But effectively, these bones are weak bones that break, not necessarily due to excessive force, but because they're weak, and it's associated with mineral deficiencies or imbalances. And we do see most of the problem in the wet areas, so Kangaroo Island, Fleurieu Peninsula, and also the lower southeast. I think this is the final condition I just wanted to mention is injection reactions. And this is why the recommendation is to inject high up on the neck, because if there is a vaccine reaction, which you can sort of see, sorry the picture's a bit blurry, but this is where the head has been cut off, so the head would have been at the bottom of this photo on the left. That vaccine reaction, if that was somewhere else in the middle of the back leg, you can imagine the mess that would be made to the carcass, as opposed to in the location where it is and just a small part of the neck, which is a low-value cut, would be removed. the program is quite difficult to monitor from a point of view of if the feedback is of value to producers, because people are consigning stock in to various processes. People are buying, are trading, so it is really hard to get an idea of how the program stands. So that survey that I mentioned earlier, it was very promising to see that 96% of producers out of 1,000 that responded thought this was of value and interest. As I mentioned, many have been alerted to something they didn't know existed. And the really promising part was that 40% of producers that received this feedback had made a management change, with a further 25% planning to make a change as a result of the feedback already received. So we feel it's a very valuable program to producers, but it is really important to understand how it works so that producers can get the most value out of the results that they're getting, and effectively implement effective management changes. So the resources I mentioned, the fact sheets, there's also an annual report which really looks at the conditions across the state, and the benchmarking documents are all available at the PIRSA website, which I have the address for there. And I think we have the PDFs for the annual report and the benchmarking documents attached to this webinar. So I think that really covers the program, but feel free, I'll hand back to Jodie, but feel free to ask any questions if you haven't typed in any sooner. And of course, if you have any questions following the webinar or at future when you're receiving feedback, please feel free to pick up the phone, because we're more than happy to go through the feedback with you, or talk about the conditions in more detail. Thank you very much, and I'll just hand back to Jodie.
Thanks, Elisa. So the first one that's come through is a question about why is there more cheesy gland in the pastoral zone in South Australia than other areas?
Sure. Yeah, look, we feel the most likely reason for that is the fact that producers in the pastoral zone don't vaccinate as much as other regions of the state. So they might be either only giving one vaccine and not following up with a booster, or not vaccinating at all. So vaccine controls this condition very well, and we just know from a point of view of logistics of what goes on those properties, it can be more difficult than other areas of the state.
Excellent. And I might just draw people's attention, there was an article, tech column in the Stock Journal written by Elisa and Tiff Bennett that's got a bit more information about cheesy gland as well. If you can't find it, it's also on the Sheep Connect website. The next question, Elisa, is about arthritis and what sort of treatments are required and how often are these needed?
For arthritis, look, I guess there's a few main causes of arthritis, and with Joan's work and also historic research and information we have, the primary cause is erysipelas. So in South Australia, we certainly have seen that as the primary cause. There are other bugs, so staph bugs and the like. And there's a very effective vaccine for arthritis if it's caused by erysipelas, and that's the Erivac vaccine. So one of the management options is vaccination. Treatment-wise, that really has to be caught very early. So producers noticing when the signs are first seen, because we can't treat those chronically thickened joints. So antibiotics can be used in the very early stages, but it's all about reducing the chance, as well as vaccine, which is very effective, reducing the chance of those bacteria and those bugs entering the body in the first place. And the prime sites of entry, of course, is either any time there's a wound. So when lambs are born, there's obviously open umbilical cord, and also obviously marking any wound. So I think the shearing cuts and also marking and mulesing increases the risk by about 4 to 7 times. So really good hygiene around those practices, putting lambs onto their feet, not just dropping them in the dirt, letting them mother up quickly, letting them walk back, not disturbing them afterwards for a period of time, and so wounds are able to heal. They're all sort of management strategies that are used around arthritis to help manage that as much as possible.
How often, was the second part of that question, do you need to vaccinate?
Yeah, so the vaccine is usually obviously given to the ewe before they land, so that their protection is passed on. So most people will start with a vaccine protocol that involves 2 boosters to the ewe and then annual boosters thereafter. And most people would just, if they're keeping ewe lambs, they'd be vaccinating the ewe lambs, but they wouldn't be vaccinating ram lambs. It's really about vaccinating before the lambs are born, so they've got that maternal protection. But certainly if you're implementing a vaccine program on your property, talking to your vet and also the Zoetis representatives for the best approach would certainly be worthwhile doing. I do know that they were developing, I don't know where that's at, vaccine guns that could administer your 6-in-1s and also your Varivac at the same time. So that's something that obviously makes life a little bit easier in regards to having to give multiple injections.
Sorry, Elise, the question was, is there any other management tool other than vaccination for cheesy gland?
Look, I guess it also is around managing contact between infected and non-infected animals. So the prime time for spread of cheesy gland is certainly at shearing, when you've got animals in close confines, and that might be that they're coughing up bacteria from their lungs, but also ruptured abscesses from shearing and contamination of the boards and the clippers. So it's really important to not hold animals in close proximity longer than is needed. But also any contamination or burst abscesses that occur during shearing, that they're dealt with, that's disinfected, cleaned up, and any animals that have obvious abscesses should be culled so they're not at risk to the rest of the flock.
Excellent. Elise, I know you were keen to talk about some other issues. I might hand back to you and...
if we've got time, I just wanted to talk a little bit about condemnations, because this has sort of been a topic that we've done some recent workshops and tours of Lobethal and also JBS, and people have been quite interested in the condemnation information. So I'll just run through that to provide additional information. Now, as I mentioned, condemnations are separate to what this program covers, but so condemnations is very much an individual animal issue. Our program looks at flock issues, but I still wanted to show you some pictures and show you some examples of some of the condemns that come through. So as I mentioned, those meat inspectors inspecting as for part of this program are located, provide a safe product at the end, and they're not company inspectors, they're independent inspectors inspecting against this document called the Australian Standard. And this document goes through the whole process from right through to transporting meat and meat products. But the areas that our meat inspectors are involved in, and also the on-plant vet, is obviously the ante-mortem inspection, so before the animals are killed, and the post-mortem inspection that we've been talking about. So for every condemnation that comes through, we have a signed condemn certificate by the on-plant vet. So the meat inspectors will assess that a carcass needs to be condemned, but it's the on-plant vet, which is a Commonwealth employed Department of Ag, used to be AQUIS vet, who signs off on the certificate. So it just goes through what they were condemned for, and this is the official documentation. There's a whole range of categories, and I've got some photos of some of these, but these are the categories that you'll see at the bottom of the kill sheet. You might have one animal that's being condemned for cancer, for example. JBS do send through the copy of the condemned slip from Department of Ag, and TFI are just looking into that at the moment, but there's usually a reason assigned, and these are the standard reasons that we see coming through. We've already talked about arthritis and the fact that they can be condemned if there's sort of a acute infectious, which means a very fresh, that's an issue with food safety, or if there's 5 or more joints affected. Bruising. These two pictures, the picture on the left is an example of dog bites, actually, and in that case, it'll just be that part of the carcass that would be removed. The picture on the right, look, it's probably not as severe enough for the whole carcass to be condemned, but it was the best picture I had. We do see animals that go down in the truck and they're completely bruised. In that case, the whole carcass is condemned. Emaciation. So when the carcasses are condemned, they can get covered in this green paint. The animals, they're not just skinny animals. they're severely emaciated, we actually get the tissue's almost sort of jelly-like, and just cannot be used for human consumption. Contamination is one that comes up from time to time and causes a bit of confusion too. And basically, contamination is contamination of the carcass with anything that therefore makes it not safe. But the important key factor here is that it's not necessarily always the processor's fault. Producers think that that they've caused the contamination, but it may well be that carcasses that are contaminated can't have been processed the same as all of the other 511 carcasses before them. Particularly if there's adhesions, and I showed you those adhesions in the lungs and the chest cavity. If there's adhesions in the abdominal cavity, as they go to remove that green offal, if it sticks and it tears, then you can result in contamination. So that carcass might just have not been made the same as the others, and therefore it's an issue with processing. The other thing, sometimes we get contamination as a result of the hide puller. And again, it may not be that it's a fault of the processing, but for example, if the animals are weak or if they're dehydrated and the skins stick, there can be issues with why that contamination occurred as a result of them just not being made the same way, or not being able to be processed in the same manner as all the other carcasses. Jaundice. Here's some pictures of some jaundice carcasses. There's lots of causes of jaundice. We don't normally see any condemns in large numbers within a line, but this is a pretty spectacular line, and you can see these carcasses are quite yellow. Sometimes, if they're really subtle, they can it can sort of reduce over 24 hours, and depending on the severity, but certainly all of these carcasses, as you can see with the green paint, were condemned. And that may have been there was a line that we had that was caused by lupinosis, where we had quite a number of carcasses, I think 33 carcasses condemned in that line. Pleurisy we've already mentioned. The carcass on the left wouldn't be condemned, it would just be trimmed. But if we had fresh pus in the chest cavity, then obviously that carcass wouldn't be fit for human consumption. And sheep measles we have really already mentioned. It's the carcass on the left that's condemned. And when looking at the number of condemns that come through, because the on-plant vets who are signing these carcasses, they come through signing these condemns of these carcasses. There are some vets that are stationed permanently at abattoirs, but there are also vets that are part of a pool. And so we might have a vet, for example, a few weeks ago I was down at JBS, and the vet that was on site at the time was then at Lobethal the next time I saw her. So they cycle through. So there usually isn't a difference between condemns based on where sheep are being consigned from an export point of view. And also, as well as those pink slips, they keep a tally for each day as to the number of condemns. And I was looking through at Bordertown the other week, and also talking to one of the livestock guys at TFI the other day, and just getting an understanding for the number of condemns that come through. And certainly through looking at quite a few weeks worth of data from JBS, I think, some days there were sort of 4 animals. There might have been, the most I saw was sort of perhaps in the double digits, 12, 14, that kind of thing. And I think Ben said, and that's sort of about 6,000 animals a day. And likewise, Ben said he was sort of looking through, and there was about 4 out of 9,000 for a day. So it is really low numbers, but and really not a flock issue. They do happen from time to time, more so in mutton lines. Obviously, they've been around longer to have developed those, developed more conditions that could be causing condemns, but we certainly don't see condemns come through in every line by any means. And I think that hopefully that just covers a little bit more information from a processor point of view. I'll hand back to Jodie now.
Thanks, Elisa. I had a couple more questions come through. One in relation to JBS, and wondering what the timeframes are before they're on board with the surveillance program? Yeah,
look, we hope to have them on board fairly soon. We've been working quite closely with them. Their inspection service is a little bit different because they still use independent meat inspectors, but they use Department of Ag. So there's just been a few more contractual arrangements that we have to have made with them. So yeah, look, we're very close. I would certainly this year, and it's looking like the next few months. They're also implementing a touchscreen system, so we should have more accurate counts of these conditions, because they'll be based on a carcass by carcass reporting. And certainly when Murray Bridge come on board with their new build, we're hoping to obviously further enhance just how accurate the collection is as well.
Thank you. So are we talking months, weeks?
For JBS?
Yeah. How long?
Yeah, for JBS will be months
Right.
at this stage, but we hope certainly before the end of the before the end of the year. So I'd be looking at between now and the end of the year.
Fantastic. And one more question about pneumonia. What sort of strategies can producers undertake on farm to reduce the incidence of pneumonia?
Pneumonia is one of those conditions where you've probably all seen those three circles where a disease really is a result of it being the right environmental conditions, there being the bug present that causes the issue, and having a suitable host or a suitably stressed host. So there's some parts of that people can't do too much about, but there are things that people can. So pneumonia is caused by certainly bacteria, viruses, and there's other causes for pneumonia. We do see a lot of pneumonia coming as what we call summer pneumonia. So as a result of sheep being in very dry conditions, dry, dusty yards. So it's more about making sure you've got an animal that can withstand threats to them. So making sure their nutrition, their immunity, all those sorts of things are up to date as much as possible, and keeping them in enough feed in suitable conditions to have them withstand issues. And then there's management factors like not rushing them, walking them back slowly, not yarding them more than you need to prevent spread of the pneumonia between animals. So it really revolves around management and making sure that you've got an animal that is able to withstand as much as possible. And that's why we see so much pneumonia coming through in lambs after weaning, because that's obviously a highly stressful time for them. But we do, it's very different to people where pneumonia, people are quick in hospital with pneumonia. Pneumonia in lambs, unless it sort of gets to that pleurisy stage where you see, like we saw with that photo, can be quite mild. But they're sort of some of the factors that can be useful.
Yep. I had a comment from Gary. He just brought to the attention that now there's a dual vaccinator available that you can administer Glandvac and Urivac at the same time in a single dose. So if people are not aware of that when they're vaccinating,
Excellent.
There's something for people to be on.
Excellent. Yeah, I knew they were bringing that out, so that's really wonderful, because that's obviously been a bit of an inhibitor. So thanks, Gary.
Yep. And that, unless anyone's got any last questions, that ends our webinar tonight. I'd like to thank Elise for her presentation tonight. So have a lovely evening, and we'll chat to you soon. Thank you. Sheep Connect is an extension project for producers both in the agricultural zone but also in the pastoral areas of South Australia, where producers can be involved in practical programs that make positive change to their farm production and management. We have a great website, sheepconnectsa.com.au. Feel free to go on there and have a look. And we also have a Twitter account, so please follow us at sheepconnectsa. Sheep Connect is not possible without valuable funding partners, and we thank them, AWI, Primary Industries and Regions, and the Sheep Industry Fund of South Australia.